The knock on my door came at exactly 7 in the morning on a Saturday, which should have been my first warning that something terrible was about to happen. I rolled out of bed, threw on a jacket over my sweatpants, and shuffled to the door of my townhouse in suburban Denver, Colorado. The cold November air hit me as I opened it, and standing there with a clipboard and an expression that could curdle milk was a woman I recognized from the neighborhood, but had never officially met. She was about 50, with blonde highlights that looked professionally done, designer athleisure where that probably cost more than my monthly utilities, and the kind of stance that suggested she was used to getting her way. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound pleasant despite being woken up. "Can I help you?" "I certainly hope so," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Mountain View Estates Homeowners Association. You're Quinton Zimmerman, correct? Unit 47B, that's me," I confirmed, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. I had only moved into this place 3 months ago and had been hoping to fly under the radar for at least a year before dealing with HOA nonsense. Patricia consulted her clipboard with the intensity of a military general reviewing battle plans. "I'm here to inform you of several violations that have been documented regarding your property. First, your mailbox is not the approved shade of black. It appears to be more of a charcoal gray. Second, you have a decorative wreath on your door that exceeds the maximum diameter of 14 inches by approximately 2 inches. And third, and most concerning, you have an unauthorized propane heater on your back patio." I blinked at her, trying to process this avalanche of absurdity. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me correctly," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she was not accustomed to repeating herself. "The propane heater is in direct violation of Mountain View Estates HOA guidelines, Section 12, subsection C, which clearly states that all heating appliances visible from common areas must be approved by the board before installation. That heater is an eyesore and a potential safety hazard." "It's a standard patio heater," I said, my early morning fog starting to clear as irritation set in. "The kind you can buy at any hardware store. I use it when I want to sit outside in the evening." "How is that a safety hazard?" Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "The HOA guidelines exist for a reason, Mr. Zimmerman. They maintain property values and ensure the safety and aesthetic coherence of our community. The heater must be removed by Monday, or you'll face a fine of $50 per day until compliance is achieved." $50 a day. I repeated, my voice rising. "For a patio heater. The rules are clearly outlined in the covenant documents you received when you purchased your property," Patricia said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "Ignorance is not an excuse for non-compliance. You have until 5 p.m. on Monday. Have a good day, Mr. Zimmerman." She turned on her heel and walked away before I could formulate a response, leaving me standing in my doorway in my pajamas, wondering if I had somehow woken up in a dystopian nightmare. I closed the door and went straight to my coffee maker, because there was no way I was dealing with this without caffeine. As the coffee brewed, I went out to my back patio to look at the offending heater. It was a perfectly normal, standard propane patio heater. The kind with a tall pole and a mushroom-shaped heat reflector on top. I had bought it at Home Depot for $200 because I enjoyed sitting outside even when the temperature dropped. It was clean, well-maintained, and positioned safely away from any structures or flammable materials. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Patricia Hendricks had just threatened me with fines over a propane heater, completely unaware that I was a natural gas and propane safety inspector for the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. It was literally my job to know everything about gas appliance safety, code compliance, and installation standards. I had spent the last 8 years inspecting commercial and residential gas systems across the state, writing violations for actual safety hazards, and educating people on proper gas appliance use. And here was this HOA president, with zero qualifications in gas safety, telling me that my properly installed, code-compliant patio heater was a hazard. I sipped my coffee and considered my options. I could just remove the heater to avoid the hassle. It was the path of least resistance, and I had learned over the years that sometimes it was easier to pick your battles. But something about Patricia's attitude rubbed me the wrong way. The condescension, the immediate threat of fines, the complete unwillingness to have an actual conversation. It felt like a power trip, and I had seen enough of those in my professional life to recognize one instantly. I decided to do some research. I retrieved the HOA covenant documents from the filing cabinet where I had stuffed them after closing on the townhouse. They were thick, printed in small font, and about as exciting to read as a phone book. But I was thorough, and if I was going to fight this, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Section 12. Subsection C did indeed mention heating appliances, but the language was vague. It stated that permanent heating installations visible from common areas require board approval. The key word there was permanent. My patio heater was not a permanent installation. It was a freestanding, portable appliance that I could move or remove at any time. By the strict definition of the rule, it did not apply. I also noticed that the covenant documents required the HOA to provide written notice of violations with a reasonable correction period, which was defined as no less than 30 days for non-emergency violations. Patricia had given me 2 days. Furthermore, the fine structure had to be approved by a majority vote of the HOA board and could not be implemented retroactively. I had never received any documentation about fine schedules. By the time I finished my research, it was nearly noon, and I had compiled a list of issues with Patricia's visit. But I decided not to act immediately. I wanted to see if she would actually follow through with her threats, or if this was just bluster meant to intimidate a new resident. Monday came, and at 5:30 p.m. my doorbell rang again. I had just gotten home from work, still wearing my company polo shirt with the Colorado PUC logo embroidered on the chest. I opened the door to find Patricia standing there with a man I did not recognize. He was tall, thin, and holding a camera. "Mr. Zimmerman," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I see the heater is still on your patio. This is Gregory Walsh, our HOA compliance officer. He's documenting the continued violation for our records." Gregory raised the camera and took several photos of my patio, the heater clearly visible through the sliding glass door. "I don't consent to you photographing my property," I said calmly. "The patio is visible from common areas," Patricia replied. "We have every right to document violations. As of 5 p.m. today, you are now accruing fines of $50 per day. You'll receive an invoice by the end of the week. I'd like to see the board resolution authorizing these fines," I said. According to the covenant documents, fine schedules require a majority board vote and must be communicated to all homeowners at least 30 days in advance of implementation. Patricia's expression flickered with surprise, but she recovered quickly. "The board has full authority to enforce covenant violations. You'll receive all relevant documentation with your invoice. I'll also need documentation of the board meeting where my violation was discussed," I continued. "The covenants require that homeowners be given the opportunity to appeal violations before fines are assessed. "You're welcome to attend the next board meeting if you have concerns," Patricia said, her tone cooling several degrees. "It's the third Tuesday of each month at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. Until then, the fines stand. I suggest you remove that heater before this becomes more expensive than it needs to be." She turned to leave, but I called after her. "Mrs. Hendricks, before you go, I'd like to address your statement that the heater is a safety hazard." She paused and looked back at me with an expression of barely concealed impatience. "What about it? What specific safety concerns do you have?" "Propane is flammable and dangerous," she said, as if explaining something to a child. "Having an open flame on a wooden deck creates fire risk. It's common sense." "The heater is on a concrete patio, not a wooden deck," I pointed out. "And it's a completely enclosed system with multiple safety features. There's no open flame exposed to the elements." "Regardless, it's a violation," Patricia said firmly. "Your personal opinions on safety don't override HOA regulations. Remove the heater, Mr. Zimmerman." She left before I could respond, Gregory trailing behind her like an obedient puppy. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, feeling my blood pressure rising. The safety hazard claim bothered me more than anything else. It was factually incorrect and demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern gas appliances worked. If Patricia was going around making these kinds of claims, she could actually create safety problems by discouraging people from using properly installed equipment, leading them to make unsafe modifications or use actually dangerous alternatives. The next morning, I made a phone call to my colleague, Sandra Morrison, who worked in the compliance division. I explained the situation, carefully keeping it professional and focused on the safety claims rather than my personal dispute. "So let me get this straight," Sandra said, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. "This HOA president is claiming that a standard patio heater is a safety hazard." "That's what she said," I confirmed. "I want to make sure I'm not missing something. Is there any scenario where a properly installed outdoor patio heater would be considered a safety violation under Colorado code?" "Not unless it's positioned incorrectly, improperly maintained, or being used in a way that contradicts manufacturer specifications," Sandra said. "You know this stuff, Quinton. Standard outdoor heaters are designed specifically for the purpose you're using it for. They have oxygen depletion sensors, tip-over protection, and flame failure devices. They're safer than most people's indoor furnaces, if we're being honest." "That's what I thought," I said, "but I wanted to confirm I wasn't crazy." "You're not crazy, but your HOA president might be," Sandra laughed. "Want me to send you the relevant code sections for your records? Might help if this goes to any kind of formal dispute." "That would be great, thanks." Sandra emailed me a comprehensive packet of information within the hour, including Colorado building codes, fire safety standards, and propane appliance regulations. I printed everything and added it to my growing file on the HOA situation. The invoice arrived on Thursday, exactly as Patricia had promised. It was a formal-looking document on HOA letterhead, charging me $350 for 7 days of violations, $50 per day from Monday through Sunday of the current week. There was no board resolution attached, no documentation of a meeting, and no information about an appeals process. Just a demand for payment within 14 days, with a threat of lien placement on my property if I failed to comply. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, eating leftover pizza and reading through the invoice for the third time. This had escalated beyond a simple disagreement about a patio heater. Patricia was now making financial threats, and I could not let that slide. If she was doing this to me, She was probably doing it to other residents who did not have the knowledge or resources to fight back. I drafted a formal response letter, keeping my tone professional but firm. I outlined the specific covenant violations in the HOA's enforcement process, provided documentation that my patio heater was not a permanent installation and therefore not subject to the cited regulation, and included the relevant Colorado building codes demonstrating that the heater met all safety standards. I concluded by requesting that all fines be withdrawn and that I be provided with proper documentation of board authorization for future enforcement actions. I sent the letter via certified mail on Friday morning before work. I also made copies of everything, including photos of my heater installation, and started a detailed timeline of all interactions with the HOA. My years as an inspector had taught me that documentation was everything in disputes. The following Tuesday, I attended my first HOA board meeting. The clubhouse was a small building near the entrance of the development, decorated in that generic corporate style that tried to look welcoming but just felt sterile. There were about 15 people in attendance, most of whom I recognized as neighbors but had never spoken to. Patricia sat at a table at the front of the room with 4 other board members. I recognized Gregory from his photography expedition, and the other 3 were women I had seen around the neighborhood. Patricia called the meeting to order with the efficiency of someone who ran these gatherings like military operations. The meeting covered standard business, budget discussions, landscaping contracts, and maintenance schedules. I waited patiently through 40 minutes of mundane subdivision management before Patricia finally got to violations and compliance. "We have several ongoing enforcement matters," she announced, consulting her notes. Unit 47B continues to maintain an unauthorized heating appliance in violation of Section 12, subsection C. Fines are accruing as scheduled. I raised my hand. "I'd like to speak about that violation." Patricia's expression hardened. "The appeals process requires written submission at least 1 week before the meeting. You didn't follow proper procedure." "I sent a certified letter 6 days ago outlining my concerns," I said calmly. I wasn't aware there was a formal appeals process, since that information wasn't included in the violation notice or the invoice. One of the other board members, a woman named Susan, leaned over to whisper something to Patricia. After a brief, tense conversation, Patricia nodded. "You may speak," she said, "but please keep it brief." I stood up, keeping my voice level and professional. "Thank you. I'm Quinton Zimmerman, and I'm contesting the violation notice for several reasons. First, the patio heater in question is not a permanent installation and therefore not subject to Section 12, subsection C of the covenants. Second, the violation notice did not provide the required 30-day correction period as outlined in the covenant documents. Third, no documentation has been provided showing that the board authorized the fine schedule being applied. And fourth, the claim that the heater is a safety hazard is factually incorrect according to Colorado building codes and fire safety standards." I pulled out the packet of documentation Sandra had sent me and held it up. "I have copies of the relevant codes here if the board would like to review them." Patricia's face had gone slightly red. "The board has full authority to determine what constitutes a safety hazard within our community. With respect, Mrs. Hendricks, the board does not have authority to override state building codes or make false safety claims," I said. "I'm a gas safety inspector for the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. It's my job to enforce actual safety standards for gas and propane appliances. The heater meets all applicable codes and standards." The room went completely silent. I could see several of the other residents looking at each other with interest. Patricia stared at me as if I had just announced I was an alien. "You're a gas inspector?" Susan asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," I said. "For the past 8 years, I inspect commercial and residential gas installations across the state. I write violations for actual safety hazards regularly. The patio heater on my property is not a hazard by any objective standard." Gregory cleared his throat. "But it's still a violation of HOA rules regardless of your profession." "That's the second issue," I said. "I don't believe it is a violation based on the actual language of Section 12, subsection C. The heater is portable, not permanent." But even if we disagree on that interpretation, the enforcement process has not followed the procedures outlined in the covenant documents. I should have been given 30 days to address the issue, not 2. And I should have been provided with documentation of board authorization for fines before they were assessed. Patricia regained her composure, her expression hardening into something between anger and determination. "The board will take your comments under advisement. This matter will be discussed in executive session. I'd like to request that any executive session discussion be documented in meeting minutes as required by Colorado HOA statutes," I said. "And I'm formally requesting copies of those minutes within the legal time frame." One of the other board members, a man named Robert, spoke up. "I'm not sure we're following proper procedure here, Patricia. Maybe we should consult with our attorney before proceeding with these fines." "We don't need an attorney to enforce our own rules," Patricia snapped, then seemed to realize her tone was too harsh. She modulated her voice. "But if it makes the board more comfortable, I can reach out to legal counsel for guidance." The meeting moved on to other business, but I could feel the shift in atmosphere. Several residents approached me afterward, asking questions about their own HOA disputes and thanking me for speaking up. One elderly couple told me that Patricia had been threatening them with fines over the color of their front door curtains, which apparently violated some obscure aesthetic guideline. I drove home that night feeling cautiously optimistic. I had made my position clear, demonstrated that I was not going to be easily intimidated, and potentially revealed that Patricia's enforcement tactics were not as legally sound as she pretended. But I also knew that people like Patricia did not back down easily. If anything, I had probably just made myself a target for even more scrutiny. Sure enough, the next week I received another notice. This time it was about my mailbox, which Patricia claimed was the wrong shade of black. The notice included a photo, a citation of the relevant covenant section, and a demand that I repaint the mailbox to approved specifications within 14 days. I examined my mailbox carefully. It was black, definitely black. I pulled out the covenant documents and found the section about mailboxes. It specified that mailboxes should be black or dark gray and provided a color code reference. I compared the color code to my mailbox using a paint matching app on my phone. My mailbox was well within the acceptable range. I took detailed photos from multiple angles in different lighting conditions and added them to my growing documentation file. Then, I sent another certified letter to the HOA, this time including a color analysis showing that my mailbox met the covenant specifications. Patricia responded by sending a different violation notice about the wreath on my door, claiming it was now 3 inches over the maximum diameter rather than the 2 inches she had originally stated. The wreath had not changed. I had not touched it since her first visit, and I had photos proving its size had remained constant. It became clear that Patricia was simply looking for anything she could cite me for. Logic and accuracy be damned. She was on a personal crusade, and I was the target. But what she did not know was that I had dealt with far more intimidating people in my professional life. Aggressive contractors, hostile business owners, and even a few people who had made actual threats. A suburban HOA president with a clipboard was not going to scare me off. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of just defending myself, I started doing some investigating into the HOA itself. I filed public records requests for HOA meeting minutes, financial reports, and board correspondence. Colorado law required HOAs to make certain documents available to members, and I was going to exercise those rights. What I found was illuminating. The HOA had been operating with questionable financial practices for years. Money that should have been going into the reserve fund for maintenance and repairs was being spent on discretionary items like decorative landscaping and clubhouse upgrades. Patricia had authorized several payments to a landscaping company that shared an address with her husband's business. The meeting minutes were sparse and often did not include required votes or documentation. I compiled everything into a detailed report, highlighting specific concerns about financial mismanagement and governance violations. Then I did something that I knew would probably escalate the situation further, but felt necessary. I sent copies to every homeowner in the development. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. My phone started ringing the next day with neighbors wanting to discuss what I had found. Several people admitted they had suspected financial problems, but had not known how to investigate or challenge the board. Others shared their own stories of harassment and unfair fines from Patricia's enforcement campaigns. A group of about 20 homeowners met at someone's house that weekend to discuss what to do. The consensus was that we needed to call for a special meeting of the full HOA membership to address the financial concerns and potentially recall the board. Patricia, predictably, did not take this well. I received a letter from an attorney representing the HOA, threatening to sue me for defamation and demanding I retract my report. The letter was full of legal-sounding language, but was ultimately toothless. Everything in my report was based on documented facts from the HOA's own records. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. I responded through my own attorney, a friend from college who specialized in real estate law. His response was professionally worded, but essentially told Patricia's attorney that they were welcome to try suing me if they wanted to lose badly and rack up legal fees in the process. The special meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after I first received the violation notice about my patio heater. The turnout was massive. Nearly 60 homeowners showed up, filling the clubhouse beyond capacity. Many people had to stand along the walls or sit on the floor. Patricia tried to maintain control of the meeting, but the mood of the crowd was not in her favor. Person after person stood up to share stories of unreasonable fines, inconsistent enforcement, and questionable financial decisions. The elderly couple with the curtain dispute described how they had been charged over $800 in fines for an issue that had never been properly documented. A single mother with 2 kids talked about being cited for having toys visible in her yard, even though other homeowners had similar items without being fined. When it came time to discuss the financial issues, Robert, the board member who had expressed concerns at the previous meeting, dropped a bombshell. He announced that he had been reviewing the financial records more carefully and had found additional irregularities beyond what I had reported. There were several payments to vendors that could not be adequately explained, and the reserve fund was nearly depleted despite HOA fees increasing twice in the past 3 years. "Where is all the money going, Patricia?" someone shouted from the back of the room. Patricia's face was bright red now, and she gripped her clipboard like a lifeline. These allegations are completely unfounded and frankly insulting. I have dedicated countless volunteer hours to this community, and this is how I'm treated, with conspiracy theories and accusations. They're not theories if there's documentation, I said, standing up. Everything I reported came from the HOA's own records. If there are explanations for these expenditures, now would be the time to provide them. I don't have to justify anything to you, Patricia snapped. You're just trying to deflect from your own violations and drum up support for your vendetta against the board. This isn't about the patio heater, I said calmly. This is about accountability and proper governance. If the board is managing our fees appropriately and following the legal requirements for HOA operations, then showing the documentation should be simple. If the board cannot or will not provide that documentation, then we have a serious problem. Susan, one of the other board members, spoke up hesitantly. Patricia, maybe we should just show them the bank statements and invoices. If everything is in order, it would resolve this quickly. We are not turning over financial records to satisfy baseless accusations, Patricia said firmly. The board has full authority over financial management. The members do not get to micromanage every decision. Actually, Colorado law requires HOAs to make financial records available to members upon request, my attorney friend Derek said from where he stood near the door. He had agreed to attend the meeting for moral support and informal legal guidance. Refusing to provide them is a violation of state statutes. Patricia glared at him. And who are you? Derek Paulson, attorney at law, he said pleasantly. I'm here as an observer and advisor. But I'd be happy to cite the specific statutes if you'd like. The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with multiple people shouting questions and demands at the board. Patricia eventually stormed out, claiming she would not be subjected to this kind of harassment. Gregory and one of the other board members followed her. Susan and Robert remained, looking shell-shocked. The remaining homeowners voted to initiate a formal recall process for the entire board and to hire an independent accountant to review the HOA's financial records. Susan and Robert both agreed to cooperate fully with the review and stated that they had not been aware of the extent of the financial issues. Over the next several weeks, the situation unraveled further. The independent accountant found that Patricia had been systematically funneling HOA funds to companies owned by her family members, overcharging for services, and pocketing the difference. The total amount involved was estimated at over $40,000, spanning 3 years. What started as an HOA dispute had become clear-cut embezzlement. The new interim board, elected at an emergency meeting after the recall vote succeeded, filed a police report. I provided statements about the timeline of events and turned over all my documentation. Patricia was arrested on a Tuesday morning, charged with theft, embezzlement, and fraud. Gregory was also charged as an accomplice, as the investigation revealed he had been aware of the financial schemes and had helped cover them up in exchange for kickbacks. The local news picked up the story, running segments about HOA abuse and financial mismanagement in suburban communities. I was interviewed, carefully keeping my comments focused on the importance of transparency and accountability in community governance. The reporter was particularly interested in the irony that the situation had started with an HOA president threatening a gas inspector over a completely safe patio heater. The legal proceedings took months to fully resolve. Patricia eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for repaying the stolen funds and serving 2 years of probation. Gregory got a similar deal. Both were permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. The new board, which included Susan and several other reasonable homeowners, immediately set about reforming the HOA's operations. They established clear, transparent financial reporting. They rewrote the enforcement procedures to ensure fairness and consistency. And they amended the covenant documents to clarify vague language and remove some of the more absurd restrictions, including the one that Patricia had tried to use against my patio heater. One of the first official acts of the new board was to formally withdraw all violations and fines that had been issued against me. They also sent a written apology, which I appreciated even though I had not asked for one. As for the patio heater that had started everything, it remained exactly where it had always been, on my concrete patio, providing warmth on cool Colorado evenings. I made a point of sitting out there often, sometimes inviting neighbors over for coffee or beer. The elderly couple with the curtain dispute became good friends, as did several of the other homeowners who had been targeted by Patricia's enforcement campaigns. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, standing up to bullies and unreasonable authority figures is worth the hassle, even when it would be easier to just comply. Second, documentation and knowledge of your rights are powerful tools in any dispute. And third, communities function better when governance is transparent, accountable, and focused on actual problems rather than petty power trips. I stayed in that townhouse for several more years, and the HOA remained functional and reasonable under new leadership. Property values actually increased once word got around that the community was well managed and no longer under the iron grip of an authoritarian board. People wanted to live in a place where they would not be harassed over their mailbox being half a shade off or having a wreath that was 2 inches too large. Eventually, I got promoted at work and transferred to a position in Grand Junction, necessitating a move. When I sold my townhouse, the new owners specifically mentioned during the walkthrough that they were relieved to hear the HOA had reformed and was no longer a nightmare to deal with. I told them the whole story, and they found it both hilarious and horrifying. My last evening in that townhouse, I sat on the patio with the heater running, enjoying the warmth and reflecting on the bizarre chain of events that a simple propane heater had set in motion. If Patricia had just been reasonable from the start, if she had approached me as a neighbor rather than a code enforcement officer on a power trip, none of it would have happened. She would not have been investigated, arrested, or exposed for embezzlement. The HOA would have continued operating in its corrupt manner, stealing from homeowners and making people miserable with petty violations. But she had chosen to target someone who happened to have exactly the right knowledge and stubbornness to fight back. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways, but in this case, it was pretty straightforward. Patricia had built a house of cards through years of unchecked authority and financial misconduct. All it took was one person saying no to bring it all tumbling down. The propane heater, that supposedly dangerous safety hazard, still worked perfectly. I took it with me to Grand Junction, where it found a new home on another patio, providing warmth without incident or HOA interference. It became something of a conversation piece when friends visited, a physical reminder of the importance of questioning authority and standing up for what is right. Years later, I sometimes wondered what happened to Patricia after her probation ended. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved out of state, presumably to escape the scandal and embarrassment. Gregory apparently got a job in retail management somewhere and kept his head down. The Mountain View Estates development continued to thrive under competent, honest leadership. As for me, I continued my career as a gas safety inspector, though the experience made me even more committed to public education about actual safety standards versus perceived risks. I gave several presentations to community groups about gas appliance safety, always making sure to distinguish between legitimate hazards and misguided fears based on misunderstanding. I also became something of an informal advisor to homeowners dealing with overzealous HOA boards. Word had spread about my successful challenge to Patricia's regime, and people would occasionally reach out for guidance when facing similar situations. I always gave the same advice. Document everything, know your rights, read your covenant documents thoroughly, and do not be afraid to push back against unreasonable demands. The whole saga from start to finish lasted about 4 months, from that first Saturday morning knock on my door to Patricia's arrest. 4 months of escalating tension, investigation, documentation, and community organizing. It could have been avoided so easily if Patricia had just been reasonable. But I suppose reasonable people do not typically end up embezzling $40,000 from their neighbors. Looking back, the most satisfying moment was not Patricia's arrest or the vindication of having all my fines withdrawn. It was the special meeting where homeowner after homeowner stood up to share their stories and support each other. It was the realization that individual people could come together to demand accountability and create positive change, even in something as mundane as a suburban HOA. The patio heater incident became a cautionary tale in local HOA management circles, an example of how poor governance and abuse of authority could spiral into criminal charges and community upheaval. I was invited to speak at a conference for HOA board members, sharing the story from my perspective and emphasizing the importance of focusing on legitimate community needs rather than petty enforcement. During that presentation, I brought photos of the infamous patio heater and walked through the relevant safety codes, demonstrating exactly why Patricia's claims about it being a hazard were baseless. The audience, composed mostly of HOA board members and property managers, found it both educational and entertaining. Several people came up afterward to admit they had been enforcing similar rules in their own communities without really understanding the technical aspects, and they appreciated the education. I always try to keep the message balanced. HOAs serve important functions when run properly, maintaining common areas, protecting property values, and fostering community. But they can also become vehicles for petty tyranny when the wrong people end up in charge. The key is accountability, transparency, and a willingness to question rules that do not make sense. The technical knowledge from my job had given me an advantage in this particular fight, but the principles applied to anyone dealing with unreasonable authority. Question claims that do not sound right. Request documentation. Understand the actual rules rather than relying on someone else's interpretation. And most importantly, do not let yourself be bullied into compliance with demands that are not legitimate. I kept in touch with several of the Mountain View Estates residents even after moving to Grand Junction. We would occasionally meet for coffee when I was in Denver for work, and they would update me on the continued reformation of the HOA. It was gratifying to hear that the community had not just survived the scandal but had emerged stronger and more united. Susan, one of the board members who had not been involved in the corruption, became the new president and did an excellent job. She implemented regular town halls where homeowners could voice concerns, established clear communication channels, and made sure that enforcement actions were fair and consistently applied. The contrast with Patricia's regime could not have been more stark. The financial recovery took some time, as Patricia's restitution payments were spread over several years and did not immediately replenish the depleted reserve fund. But the new board managed the situation well, being transparent about the challenges and working with homeowners to develop a sustainable path forward. They even managed to avoid a special assessment, which had seemed inevitable when the extent of the embezzlement first came to light. As for my career, the whole experience made me better at my job in unexpected ways. I had always been technically competent, knowing the codes and standards inside and out. But dealing with Patricia and the HOA situation taught me more about the human side of enforcement and compliance. I became more patient in explaining technical concepts to people without relevant background knowledge, recognizing that what seemed obvious to me might be genuinely confusing to others. I also became more vigilant about distinguishing between legitimate safety concerns and aesthetic preferences dressed up as safety issues. Patricia had claimed my heater was dangerous, but her real objection was that she did not like how it looked. I saw this pattern repeated in various contexts throughout my work, people justifying subjective preferences with false safety claims because they knew safety arguments carried more weight. My approach became more educational as a result. When I encountered situations where people had genuine misconceptions about gas safety, I took the time to explain the actual risks and the engineering safeguards built into modern appliances. Most people were receptive once they understood the technical details, and I found that education prevented future problems more effectively than simple enforcement. The patio heater itself became something of a good luck charm. It never malfunctioned, never caused any problems, and continued to provide reliable warmth for outdoor activities. I joked with friends that it was the most scrutinized patio heater in Colorado, having survived attempted HOA banishment and served as exhibit in an embezzlement investigation. I eventually upgraded to a larger model when I bought a house in Grand Junction with a bigger back patio, but I kept the original heater in my garage. It was too much a part of my personal history to get rid of, a physical reminder of standing up for what was right and the unexpected consequences of doing so. The story took on a life of its own in certain circles. It was shared on social media, discussed in online forums about HOA horror stories, and even mentioned in a couple of news articles about HOA reform efforts across the state. People appreciated the justice of a petty tyrant being brought down by her own overreach, targeting exactly the wrong person with exactly the wrong complaint. I was never comfortable with being characterized as a hero in these retellings. I had simply defended my right to use a perfectly safe appliance and refused to be bullied. The real heroes were the homeowners who had been suffering under Patricia's regime for years, but did not have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. My technical expertise had given me an advantage, but their courage in speaking up once someone else had opened the door was what really brought about change. The legal system had worked correctly in this case, but I was aware that it did not always. If Patricia had been more careful, if she had not been quite so blatant in her corruption, she might have gotten away with it indefinitely. The fact that she had targeted me so aggressively had accelerated the investigation, but the underlying problems would have existed regardless. That realization made me more committed to advocating for HOA reform at the state level. I testified before a legislative committee considering bills to strengthen financial oversight requirements for HOAs and establish clearer procedures for member complaints. My testimony focused on the Mountain View Estates case as a concrete example of what could go wrong when accountability mechanisms were weak. Some of the reforms passed, though others got watered down in committee or failed to gain enough support. Legislative change is slow and incremental, but every improvement in oversight and transparency made it a little harder for the next Patricia to abuse her position. I also made a point of encouraging friends and colleagues to get involved in their own HOA governance, even if things seemed to be running smoothly. Good governance required engaged members, not just to stop bad actors, but to support good board members trying to do the right thing. Susan had told me that one of the hardest things about serving on the reformed board was the apathy of most homeowners, who only paid attention when something went wrong. The whole experience changed my perspective on civic engagement in general. Before this happened, I had been relatively apolitical and uninvolved in community issues beyond my job. I voted, paid my taxes, and figured that was sufficient civic duty. But seeing how much impact one determined person could have, and how much damage one corrupt person in a small position of power could cause, made me realize that engagement mattered at every level. I started attending city council meetings in Grand Junction, volunteering for local boards and commissions, and generally paying more attention to how my community was governed. It was not always exciting or glamorous work, but it was important. The mundane details of zoning decisions, budget allocations, and policy implementations affected people's daily lives in significant ways. The propane heater incident had been a crash course in local governance, legal procedures, and community organizing. I had learned more in those 4 months than I probably would have learned in years of casual observation. And while I would not have chosen to go through that stress and conflict, I was ultimately grateful for the lessons it taught me. One unexpected benefit was the relationships I formed with neighbors and community members. Before the HOA dispute, I had been friendly but somewhat isolated, focused on work, and not really putting down roots in the community. The shared experience of challenging Patricia and reforming the HOA had created real connections with people, turning a collection of strangers who happened to live near each other into an actual community. Those relationships persisted even after I moved. I stayed in touch with many of the Mountain View Estates residents, visiting when I was in Denver and keeping up through social media and occasional phone calls. We had been through something together, a small battle against injustice and corruption, and that created a bond that lasted beyond geographical proximity. The story eventually reached someone who worked in documentary production, and I was approached about participating in a short film about HOA disputes and reform. I agreed, figuring that the more attention these issues received, the better chance of preventing similar situations elsewhere. The documentary crew interviewed me, Susan, several other homeowners, and even got a brief interview with Patricia after her release from probation. Patricia's interview was uncomfortable to watch. She was defensive and unwilling to take full responsibility for her actions, claiming she had been trying to protect property values and had made some mistakes in judgment, but was not a criminal. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Her inability or unwillingness to recognize the harm she had caused, or the wrongness of stealing from her neighbors. But the documentary also included her perspective as a cautionary tale about how power can corrupt, even in small, seemingly insignificant positions. The producers did a good job of balancing the narrative, showing both the specific case of Mountain View Estates and the broader context of HOA governance issues across the country. The film premiered at a small film festival in Boulder and later aired on a local PBS station. I attended the premiere with several of the other participants, and it was surreal to see my patio heater on a big screen, presented as evidence in a story about community activism and governance reform. The audience reaction was gratifying, with lots of questions during the queue and a session about how people could apply similar strategies in their own communities. Years passed, and the immediate drama faded into memory, but the lessons remained relevant. I continued to work as a gas inspector, continued to advocate for HOA reform, and continued to use my patio heater without interference. Life returned to normal, but it was a normal informed by the understanding that standing up to unreasonable authority was possible and necessary. I eventually met someone special, a teacher named Francine Barrett, who had her own stories of dealing with bureaucratic absurdity in the education system. We bonded over shared experiences of fighting institutional dysfunction and trying to make systems work better. When I told her the patio heater story on our third date, she laughed so hard she cried, and I knew I had found someone who understood me. We got married 2 years later, and the patio heater made an appearance at our wedding reception, decorated with flowers and positioned next to a sign explaining its significance. It was a quirky touch that perfectly captured our sense of humor and our shared commitment to standing up for what is right, even in the face of ridiculous opposition. Francine and I bought a house together in Grand Junction, a place with a large back patio perfect for entertaining. The patio heater, both the original one and the larger, newer model, became centerpieces for countless gatherings with friends and family. Every time someone asked about them, I would tell the story, and it never got old seeing people's reactions to the absurdity of the situation and the justice of the outcome. The Mountain View Estates, HOA, continued to function well under reformed leadership. Property values increased, maintenance was kept up properly, and residents generally felt good about their community. It became a positive example of what HOAs could be when run with integrity and common sense, a stark contrast to the nightmare it had been under Patricia's control. I sometimes wondered if Patricia had learned anything from the experience, or if she still believed she had been unfairly persecuted for trying to maintain standards. Based on her documentary interview, I suspected it was the latter. Some people are so invested in their own righteousness that they cannot acknowledge when they are clearly in the wrong. That inability to self-reflect is probably what had allowed her to justify embezzlement in the first place. But that was her problem to deal with, not mine. I had moved on, built a good life, and turned a frustrating experience into something positive. The patio heater that had started everything continued to serve its simple purpose, keeping people warm on cool evenings and facilitating outdoor gatherings. It was exactly what it had always been, a safe, code-compliant appliance designed for outdoor heating. The irony that Patricia's crusade against it had led to her own downfall was not lost on anyone who knew the story. If she had just left me alone, if she had not threatened fines and made false safety claims, I never would have started investigating the HOA's operations. Her own aggressive overreach had created the circumstances for her exposure and prosecution. In the end, the whole saga was a reminder that small acts of resistance matter. One person refusing to be bullied, one person asking questions and demanding accountability, one person standing up and saying this is not right, it could change everything. The propane heater was just a catalyst, a mundane object that became significant because it was the line Patricia chose to draw and the line I chose to defend. That line led to justice, reform, and a stronger community. It led to new friendships, valuable lessons, and a story that continues to inspire others facing similar struggles with petty tyrants and corrupt officials. and it confirmed something I had always believed, but had never quite proven to myself: that doing the right thing, even when it is difficult and uncomfortable, is always worth it in the end. The heater still works perfectly, warm and reliable, a testament to proper engineering and safety standards. And every time I turn it on, sitting outside with Francine or friends, enjoying the warmth and the company, I am reminded of that cold November morning when Patricia knocked on my door and inadvertently set in motion her own undoing. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes standing your ground against absurdity leads to outcomes more satisfying than you could have imagined.